Section 5 of Brazilian Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leni. Brazilian Tales by various authors. Translated by Isaac Goldberg. Section 5. The Pigeons by Coelho Neto, member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. When the pigeons leave, misfortune follows. Indian superstition. When Joanna appeared at the door, yawning, fatigued after the long sleepless night spent at her son's bedside, Tiburcio, on the terrace, leaning against his spade, was watching the pigeon-house closely. The sun was already setting, and gilded the moist leaves. At the edge of the ravine, turtle-doves and starlings were circling in the air, making a joyous noise above the high branches of the neighboring trees. The caboclo Indian did not remove his eye from the pigeon-house. Caboclo signifies copper-colored. Indigenous tribes of Brazil are so called from the color of their skin. The wrinkles on his forehead bore witness to an inner struggle, grave thoughts which were clouding his spirit. A pigeon took to flight, then another, and still another. He turned his head, following them with his gaze until they were out of sight, and then returned to his melancholy contemplation. The birds came and went, entered the pigeon-house, and left in agitated manner, cooing loudly. They circled above the dwelling, sought the trees, alighted on the thatch of the cabin, descended to earth in spiral flight. Some seemed to be getting their bearings, to seek a route. They gazed across the clear stretches of space and penetrated to the distant horizons. Others would fly off, describing vast circles, and would return to the pigeon-house. Then all would come together, as if for a discussion, to plan their departure. Some, undecided, opened their wings as if about to fly away, but soon would close them again. Still others would dart off, only to come back aimlessly, and the noise increased to a hubbub of hurried leaving. The Indian gazed fixedly. Well he knew that the life of his little son was at stake, and depended upon the decision of the birds. When the pigeons leave, misfortune quickly follows. Joanna noticed his preoccupation. "What is the matter?" she asked. The caboclo scratched his head and made no reply. The woman insisted. "What is the trouble, Tiburcio?" "The pigeons have taken a whim into their heads, Joanna." "And you are lost in the contemplation of it?" "I have not cared to speak, but I know well the meaning of what I see." The caboclo slung the spade across his shoulder and walked, slowly, up the road that led to the plantation, through the wet hay which exhaled a piquant odor. Some hens were clucking, hidden in the high grass, and a little ribbon of water, which flowed gently along, sparkled here and there through the openings in the brushwood. Tiburcio, head bowed, spade on his shoulder, could not shake off the deep impression that had been made upon him by the sudden migration of the birds. It was the fatal sign. To be sure, he had heard the owl screech for many and many a night, but he had seen no cause for fear in this. Everything was going along nicely. Their little son was in good health, and they, too, knew no illness. But now the warning of the evil omen was confirmed. The pigeons which he had himself brought up were flying away. They were leaving, thus forecasting the arrival of death. He turned back. He raised his eyes. There were the birds high above, still circling about, and Joanna was at the threshold of the cabin, leaning against the jamb, her arms crossed, her head hanging. The poor woman was surely weeping. Within him he felt a mute explosion of hatred and revolt against the ungrateful birds. Never had he had the courage to kill a single one of them. He lived only for the purpose of keeping the pigeon-house in order, thinking only of making it larger so that it might accommodate more pairs. And the little child, was it not he who crushed the millet for the fledglings, who climbed the mango-tree, going from branch to branch to see whether there wasn't some crack through which the rain came in? Who knows? Perhaps the pigeons were leaving their dwelling because they no longer saw him? He shrugged his shoulders and continued on his way. As he crossed the dam, his heart palpitated wildly. He stopped. The water, held back in its course, threw back a motionless reflection of him. But although he looked down upon it, he saw not his image. His thoughts were entirely with the little child who, burning with fever, was in delirium. He chose a side path. The millet stems were so high that he disappeared within them with a crumpling of dry leaves. The soft ant-hills which it was his daily custom to level off failed to attract his attention. He walked straight on. Parrots flew by, chattering, with their green wings shining in the sun, and huge grasshoppers were jumping in the leaves. He came upon a straw hut. Here the child was wont to play with its toys. There was even now a boot of wild sugar-cane. But already the grass was beginning to invade the abandoned shelter. For a month the little child had not visited the place. When the father came to the field of manioc, he sat down, bent almost in two. The spade weighed upon his shoulders like a burden. The strength had oozed out of his legs. His whole body was broken with fatigue, as if at the end of a long journey. He sat down upon a hillock and began to trace lines upon the earth, with a distraught air. At times it seemed as if he had heard the echo of his wife's voice. He would raise his head and strain his ears to catch the sound. But only the rustling of the leaves stirred by the breeze and the chirping of the insects in the sun came to him. All earth seemed to perspire. A diaphanous vapour rose tremblingly from the hot soil. The leaves hung languidly, and through the intense blueness of the sky passed some urubus in search of distant lodgings. Urubu, the black vulture of South America. Suddenly a pigeon winged through the air, then another, and still another. They were leaving. They were leaving. A beating of wings, more on the way. They would never return, never. They were fleeing in horror, feeling the approach of death. For a long time he gazed about him, but could see only the rich verdure waving to the wind in the warm transparency of the atmosphere. He should have taken his child to town as soon as the illness had appeared. But who could have foretold this? He raised his eyes to heaven, and they lingered upon the luminous azure. Then came another pigeon. He shook his head, and striking his fist against his thigh, slung his spade back upon his shoulder, and turned in the direction of his house. When Joanna saw him on the terrace, she appeared to divine his thoughts. "It is well you returned, my dear. All alone here, I am at a loss as to what to do." He looked at the pigeon-house, saw that it was deserted, and ominously silent. As evening fell, Tiburcio sat down upon the threshold of the cabin and began to smoke, waiting for the pigeons. The grasshoppers were shrilling. All the birds who had their nests in the tree near-by retired, and, as it was still light, they lingered in the branches to trill their good-night cadences. The sky grew pale. The landscape was veiled in a light mist. The evening breeze scattered the gentle odor of lilies. Not very far off, a dog barked now and then. At times a grave lowing saddened the silence. Tiburcio did not remove his eyes from the pigeon-house, unless it was to pierce the shadows and try to discover in the distance one of the birds. Perhaps some of them would return. Where could they find a better shelter? The forest was full of dangers, and domestic pigeons could scarcely live in the brushwood. What other pigeon roost could have attracted them? If he had but followed the line of their flight! Some had taken the direction of the fields, others had flown towards the mountains, and there was no sign of any returning. It was now quite dark. Joanna lighted a candle. Already the frogs were croaking in the marshes. A star shone in the sky. Tiburcio fixed his gaze upon it and began to pray in low tones. The silence was scarcely broken by the murmuring of the water as it ran and broke over the stones in the ravine not far away, just behind the cabin. Tiburcio sighed, arose, leaned against the jamb